Hello, and welcome to the AP Automation Videocast series sponsored by Perceptive Software. Today's topic is Evolving Shared Service Centers, a focus on organizational and process agility. But before I introduce our guest analysts, let me touch on a few housekeeping items. First, if you haven't done so already, we encourage you to take a few seconds to enable the group chat function within the AP Automation eDigest by clicking on Group Chat. That button's in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. This will allow you to see and collaborate with other attendees and submit questions to the presenters throughout the presentation. Second, a replay of this videocast will be available through the eDigest shortly following the live event. You can also access our previous videocasts on AP Automation, as well as preview the topics and speakers for February and March. So now let me welcome and introduce our guest analyst from Forrester Research, Craig Le Clair. Craig is the Vice President and Principal Analyst serving enterprise architecture professionals. He is internationally recognized expert in business process management. He specializes in helping companies transform from manual and paper-based processes to the mobile and digital world, as well as in information management, dynamic case management, enterprise content management, electronic signature, document imaging and capture, and document output for customer communications management. Craig is a leading analyst on the outsourcing of document processing services, including managed print services. And he brings a wealth of information and knowledge to Forrester through his 20 years experience in IT and business process transformation. And he is deeply experienced in the software industry, having authored How to Succeed in the Enterprise Software Market. And so welcome, Craig. Thank you for spending the time with us today.
Absolutely, my pleasure. Thank you, Matt, for that probably too long introduction. A lot of content here, so I'm going to get into it. As Matt mentioned, the main focus is on evolving shared services, which has always been the holy grail for a lot of companies to build assets that can be leveraged across departments to solve a number of the IT and technology problems that companies have in trying to deal with the rapid changes that we see in the world. So let me first start with just going over the agenda real quickly. I'm going to do a little bit of setup on business agility, what it is. If you talk to 3 different executives, they'll all give you a slightly different definition, so we'll give you ours. And then we'll take a look at different aspects of agility. You'll see there are 10 dimensions that we've defined for agility, and we'll focus on organizational and process agility as being the most important for shared services. And we'll take a look at the role of content and process technologies, the thing that, as Matt mentioned, I've covered for years and have a good understanding of. We'll talk about how they can help transition to more of an agile enterprise. Now, the sort of context for all of this whole narrative on agility is really the changes we've seen in the world in the last 3, 4, 5 years. If you think about the way businesses operated for a very long time, they dominated in the age of manufacturing and distribution. They really dominated with scale and with the factories and with economies of scale and with large brands that had great trust behind them. And that's sort of given way as we've looked at more of an information-led economy starting really in the 1990s with companies like Amazon and Google that really changed the way business operates. But today we're at a very strong pivot point, which Forrester calls the age of the customer. And you might look at that cynically and say, well, the customer has always been important, so what is this age of the customer? Well, it's a very simple concept, but a very powerful one. An easy way to think about it is the way your parents might have bought a car, say 20, 25 years ago. You went to one car dealer in town, and they had 90% of the information about the car. They told you what the price was. Maybe you haggled a little bit. They told you all the information about it and the specs. They had brochures to hand you and so forth. And think of today's car buying experience. Very, very different. The consumer spends 12 hours online doing price comparison sites, getting social media reviews of cars. They walk in as a much more informed customer. So that's what we mean by the age of the customer. The trends in mobility, the trends in social media have really shifted information power to the customer. And companies that don't get that shift and don't start adjusting how they interact with that customer are going to be losers. So the age of the customer really leads to why business agility is so important. But there's no better way to present that than looking at some of the macroeconomic data that's available. We took a look at the Fortune 1000, which of course is the list of companies that have the most revenues in the world. And if you look at that list and look at the character of the list in the decade 73 to 83, at the beginning of the time period 1973, and comparing it to the end, there were only 35% of the list that turned over, meaning that only 350 of the 1,000 companies left the list and were replaced by companies that now exceeded them in revenue. So you had some volatility and some turnover. You had new companies coming in and older companies dropping off. But take a look at, let's dial forward to the decade 2003 to 2013. Dramatically different. That 70% of the companies that were on the list in 2003 are no longer there in 2013. So what you're seeing, this is a good proxy for the amount of volatility and the strategic risk that companies are facing today. And this is why being agile, being able to respond to events that occur, to respond to changing conditions, is really, really become the top of the business technology agenda today. In a nutshell, companies face a much stronger strategic risk than they ever did before. In the old days, on the left-hand part of this chart, in the old disruption days, really you had to open up a factory. You had a small number of innovators, the geniuses that really created the first commercial jet for Boeing, the Tom Watsons of the world that initiated the IBM mainframe. A small number of very, very powerful people could create new industries, and they needed a lot of dollars to do it. IBM bet a third of the capital of the company on the mainframe. Boeing similarly with the first commercial jet. But look on the right side of this. Every year we graduate from our top universities thousands of innovators that, armed with very little capital, can't wait to go out and tear down your business with new disruptive technologies like the sharing economy, like Airbnb and Uber, and companies that take a completely digital and totally new approach and really chip away at the traditional value chain of the more established companies. So that's a huge risk for companies, and that's really the underpinnings of why business agility is so critical. Now, I'm going to talk about the 10 dimensions of business agility, which we believe that if companies focus on these 10 dimensions, then it will be the antidote to disruption. So let's take a look at this. There are really, for the 10 dimensions, there are really two aspects of each that are really important. And they're very simple concepts: awareness, knowing what's going on, having the information to know what's going on, and then based on that information, being able to execute, being able to do something with that information. And if you look at it, you have an awareness dimension aspect and a execution aspect for each of these 10 dimensions. And if you can do both well, if you both know what's going on and can execute, then you're formidable. However, if you can't do either, if you can't execute on information and you don't have the information, then you're clueless. Now, some companies become paralyzed because they actually know what their competitors are doing. They know what their customers want, but they can't get out of their own way. They can't execute. So we call that the paralyzed segment. And then this is my favorite segment, the dangerous segment, which is where you can execute pretty quickly, but you really don't know what to do. So you might be doing the wrong thing, and you become, in a sense, dangerous. You can do something dumb really fast. And I must say, I've actually worked for companies like that had a very strong operational excellence. They could tactically, master project management and get something done, but they didn't really have those strategic tentacles out into the market to understand what the industry was doing and what their competitors were doing. That's a very dangerous situation. So we did lots of surveys that I'll talk about, but for each of these 10 dimensions, we were able to measure the awareness and execution for thousands of companies, and that's the data that I'm going to show you in a minute, which is really fascinating information, we think. But there are three buckets. There are two market dimensions that are really critical. And one is channel integration. And you can think of that really as jumping into the mobile mindset, really having a strong mobile solution. But it's not just about an app. It's about being able to create that omni-channel experience, which is understanding the context of the customer as they traverse the customer journey and actually traverse different channels. And to do that, you need information sharing and cross-channel experience. And we'll see where companies are with that. Market responsiveness is very basic. You really need to be able to understand what the customer wants and be able to have rapid access to your market and R&D resources to be able to respond to that. Now, organizational agility is going to be a focus of this conversation today because we believe that's really important for shared services because oftentimes when organizations put together a corporate solution, they're not communicating it well enough to the employees that they're serving, and they're not having the characteristics of organizational agility that really change that from an old shared service model to a new one. So we'll get into that more, but some of these aspects have to do with the dissemination of knowledge dissemination, by flattening the organization, by having local agility and local control for the shared service, by having the right digital psychology, having a culture of accepting and embracing the opportunities that the age of the customer provides for companies, and of course change management. So we're going to talk about those in the context of shared services in a minute. For completeness, the process agility dimensions are 5, and this has to do with analytics, business intelligence, the leverage of the cloud. As we know, cloud ecosystems and cloud infrastructures are becoming a fertile, agile point for a lot of companies. They can create compute resources really rapidly. They can get really strong data integration. They can leverage an app ecosystem that's forming around that cloud infrastructure. So that's an important agility dimension going forward. Software innovation, and then sourcing and supply chain. So when you look at these 10 dimensions of agility, this is some of the data that we got back, and we basically created questions for each of these 10 into a 20-question survey and then launched it to hundreds of companies. And we came back in aggregate, companies are very paralyzed in terms of their use of analytics. And I won't go through all of these in the interest of time, but just a few. In the analytics world, there's been a strong investment in things like BI and other forms, predictive analytics and big data analytics and so forth. But the use of analytics has not been spread to the business. So it's still more of a technology management game. So our view of agility for analytics is not just that you have the awareness of it in terms of its technology and how to use it, but that you actually distribute that intelligence to the business, and that's not being done. If you look at channel integration, in terms of that cross-channel information sharing, clueless. Most companies are scored very, very poorly on that. Market responsiveness, dangerous zone. In other words, companies are able to allocate marketing resources rapidly, so they execute well. But from an awareness standpoint, they don't really understand what the customer wants. They don't have the feelers out into the customer in a big enough way to be able to do the right thing. So that's a dangerous dimension for many. So looking at this, we always ask our questions, why does any of this matter? So the only reason agility matters in a business context is really being able to drive revenue and profit. So what we did is we separated out the companies that were high performers from our survey and low performers, on things like total shareholder return and growth in revenue and in revenue. So we took we separated out into 2 piles, the really high performers and the low performers, and we looked at their agility scores. and found, fortunately for our research, that there was a huge difference, that high-performing companies on the right here really have much higher agility scores. And if you look at it, they're formidable in channel integration, they're formidable in digital psychology, they're formidable in analytics, whereas low performers on the left really lag in almost all categories, except for supply chain. So there's a clear difference. Basically, if you can build a more agile enterprise, it will pay off in the bottom line. And you can take this data to your CEO and say, we need to invest in these 4 dimensions where we're really weak competitively. And Forrester has data that's broken down by industry, so you can see where your peers are more agile than you are in your specific industry, and you can work on those. You can work on those specific agility dimensions. So let's pivot now to how organizational and process agility can really help with building shared services. So to do that, we first have to contrast today's shared services model, where Forrester thinks a real global business services model needs to get to in the future. So chart's a little bit busy, but there are key drivers in today's model. You generally have low business flexibility, poor time to market characteristics. You're not really empowering the users of that shared service. You have high efficiency and integration and standardization. And that's been really the mantra for today's shared services. The success metrics, just jumping down to the bottom, cost savings. It's really about consolidation of systems to get lower maintenance, lower people support for that shared asset. If you look to the right, there's a common theme through the emerging global business services model, and that's flexibility, agility, responsiveness, moderate efficiency of integration and standardization. So you're shifting from just standardizing to really providing an asset that is really driven by business results. It's driven by the pace of change. It's driven by responsiveness to customers. So agility becomes a major theme and aspect for tomorrow's global services model, which is why we've highlighted that in this presentation. So when you look at the integrated global services model, it's really a change from what you're doing today. It's more end-to-end, focused. It's more of an operating model. So there's a lot of emphasis today in process redesign on what are called target operating models, capability mapping, customer journey mapping. All of these process design methodologies are trying to do the same thing. They're trying to take an outside-in view, a customer-oriented focus, and they're trying to deal with the end-to-end process so that you don't end up driving the customer, and the customer could be a business, not just a consumer, driving the customer through a pattern of information silos, functional departments, where the experience is a disjointed one. So you're trying to really look at the design of the process from an end-to-end standpoint. Agility is a key aspect of that, as well as engagement. So you're moving from just trying to consolidate a shared system for a system of record, but really try to build a system of engagement perspective around that shared service. And I think the last bullet is the most important one, this global-local balance. Old shared services models really were trying to focus on standardization and trying to get everyone in the global enterprise to operate in the same way. And we know that there's a lot of process variation, and it certainly is driven by geographic requirements. It's driven by cultural requirements. You've got to allow a layer of innovation for your shared services users. So you need to have agility in the technologies and in the process to be able to do that. So looking at organizational dimensions, how do you really drive that? How do you really make that real for shared service? And just to sort of expand on the high and low performers assessment that we did, if you look at the 3 organizational dimensions, and of course it's always good to repeat them, knowledge dissemination, and I'll talk about what that is in a minute, digital psychology and change management. These are the gaps between high and low performers. Now, in knowledge dissemination, there's a significant gap, but not as big. The biggest gaps are in change management, and in digital psychology. Those companies that had skills and maybe deploying the ADKAR change management model, that had executives that understood how to implement change management, were much higher performers. It was a huge difference between high and low performance, as well as those that had invested for digital psychology, that had invested in changing the culture to be one accepting digital. So let's take a look at these in more detail. We'll first look at knowledge dissemination. So if you look at what that means, low awareness in the general case of the aggregate in the industries means that companies are not investing in social and collaboration tools. And execution access is more about how flat the organization is versus hierarchical. And the two are very much related. If you're using something like a content collaboration, file sync and share systems, Google Drive, Box, enterprise social platforms like Chatter from Salesforce, or Yammer from Microsoft, or Connections from IBM, then you're able to share information in a much broader way. You're able to empower employees at a much lower level, and you're pushing decision making down into the organization in a much better way, and that is really important for being able to respond to market conditions, to be able to respond to change. Now, what that does is when you start to do that, you start to flatten out the organization. You create virtual teams that can swarm an issue in a much better way. So it's not just the claims department versus the submissions department in an insurance company. You can see, because the information is in an activity stream available to everybody, you can understand that there's a customer issue and dive on it. This is a company, a 190-year-old insurance company, so very conservative company, that implemented a strong knowledge dissemination program. And they did knowledge sharing portals, social tools, desktop micros, webcam, and they changed the whole culture of the company. Employees now speak up multiple levels of management. They became a much more agile company. Now, let's pivot to digital psychology. It's a little bit of a more abstract concept, but a really critical one. And if you look at where companies are, this is some data that we have that executives really doubt that their companies are ready for digital transformation. They don't have the right digital psychology. That's what this chart says. 21%, only 21% think the CEO has a clear vision for how to turn their business into data, how to become a digital business. This is not where you want to be in today's age of the customer. So there's a real problem in companies in having a top-down appreciation for what digital can do and mean to your business, and to promote that. So when you look at digital psychology, there are two very quick case studies that I think are really, really terrific in this area. Now, we all know Nestle's huge company, hundreds of brands. They have a team, a digital acceleration team, that they have to really just change the thinking about how to use digital. So these are experts in building communities and social media and building mobile apps and so forth, and they dispatch them to the individual lines of business to help what they call create digital vitamins to actually advance their digital thought patterns and services capabilities. So in the KitKat brand, which amazingly has 16 million followers on Facebook. I just can't understand why people would want to be so participating in it. I like the candy as well. But they helped build that community by having these innovators in digital dispatched to the various units. And Nestle's is a huge company. How many do you think they have in this group? A dozen. It's not hundreds of people. It's a dozen. 7-Eleven, similarly has routine hackathons, and they have some really interesting, mobile apps that leverage GPS. And if you're of a certain temperature and you want to buy, you might be interested in the new Slurpee version that's coming out. They'll connect you with a coupon knowing your distance. That was developed in a hackathon by an employee of 7-Eleven. So these are ways to foster strong digital psychology in companies. And if you think about it, attitude drives everything. So if employees have a negative attitude, they're going to perform negatively. So that brings us to change management. And this was a personal certification institute that you would know, and they had a very long-standing, complex, analog, paper credentialing workflow. And they were going to change that. They were going to put in business process management software. They were going to be able to, automate that process. But it really was going to affect people's jobs in a big way. That's what change management is. It's people thinking about, what does this do to my career? Will I have a job? It's that kind of attitude, chipping away at that positive attitude, that really is bad. This is a very good example of a change management action at the end of a milestone in the project where they were going to eliminate the paper. They would have a party, and they would all sit around, and in this case, they rolled in a shredder. And at the one point where they eliminated the paper, they just shredded it all, and then everyone just clapped. It sounds a little silly, but it's this attention to people's morale and people's attitudes that are really, really critical. What you're trying to do at the end of the day is move from this sort of union negotiated smile for employees to feel that they're hemmed in, to really one of an employee who really likes to work there, really believes in the company. And you see that in different airlines. When I get on a JetBlue flight, the employees seem to be happy there. When I get on other airlines, I won't mention their names, they look like they're ready to jump out of the plane, right? So, attitude does affect performance, no question. So this is moving to the process area. So that was the organizational dimensions. Let's talk about analytics. And analytics is fueling the next generation of the information economy. And most companies are still in a paralyzed state with analytics. They have high awareness. They've done some investment. They're certainly reading about it, but they haven't distributed to the business. And this is really, really critical. Now, one case study here, which I find interesting, because if you could think of a tanker at sea being agile, then almost anything can. But this was a case where the tanker is out at sea filled with oil. And there's real-time analytics that are used to figure out where the highest price for oil, for crude, is at any point in the world. And they literally turn this ship around and point it to that port. A great example of using analytics. And I asked on this interview, I said, how much do you save? I mean, what's the ROI on an application like that? And the answer was, and this was before the oil prices dropped, but the answer was $25 to $50 million every time we do it. So analytics, even a small amount, can have a tremendous impact on your bottom line. So looking at shared services, and then now that we're on the process segment, how do you enhance your process agility? And these are just some ideas that we have, based on a long review of various technologies that are sort of the agile technologies that are usually built on top of shared services, on top of your product capabilities, really to give you more customer capabilities. So if you look at it, what we're saying, and I've blown up the top part of that previous chart, is that you want to keep these functions: customer workflows, customer data management, customer event broker technology, customer analytics and reporting, client communications. You want to keep them away from the legacy product transaction systems, the product-centric departmental type of systems of record, and you want to lift them to a customer layer to have essentially an agile foundation built on top of those product silos. And what does this do? It allows you to build the shared capabilities. So now you have communications that aren't just buried in each of those transaction systems, and now can be shared by everyone. You have a shared service for analytics and reporting. You have a shared service for customer workflows. So this is a really critical aspect for building shared services, is that this is how you get that local and global difference, that local agility. It's by having a foundation and a process layer that allows you to implement local functions that are really important to that geography. You're not locking them in to a single way of doing business. And that's really critical. And that's why we bring up these agile technologies: content management, business process management, customer, master data management, and analytics are really the key foundation elements to really provide that process agility that you need. So just a few recommendations, and I'll turn it over to Matt. Number one, this is what you can do tomorrow. So there's a lot of narrative in the industry about the age of the customer, which we're responsible for in some way, and about big data and understanding the customer, and that's all great. That's where things are going. But I think for shared services, for the next generation of integrated services, you need to think beyond just market dimensions. You want to be thinking about those process and organizational dimensions. Those are actually more important for a corporate solution than the market dimensions. It's really about digital psychology, knowledge dissemination. And with that, you can communicate better, communicate what you're doing, and you can provide that local agility that you need from a process perspective. So that's the talk on business agility and shared services, and I'm going to turn it over to Matt, and I thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks, Craig, very much. So before I let you go, I think we do have a question, and I want to make sure that if you haven't done so already, go ahead and look at or enable the group chat function within the AP Automation eDigest by clicking on the Join Group Chat button in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. This will allow you to see and collaborate with us and other attendees and submit questions to us. But one question that we have already, and I think you talked a little bit about this in the beginning of the conversation, but why is business agility so much on the agenda today, so much more than it was a few years ago?
Well, it's companies fearing being Uberized. Their fear of an Airbnb. It's knowing that this cycle of business staying viable is decreasing to such an extent. So you can no longer build your technology and your processes to support just one way of doing business and think that'll last for a generation, which is the way it was for most of our time. Now you have to think about building your technology infrastructure or going to the cloud to be able to change your entire business, within a 3 to 5 year life cycle. Companies are realizing that they're really technology companies, and as such, they are in the innovation business. And like a pure technology company, you have to change your products every 3 years. You can't, what you're selling today is not what you're going to be selling in 2.5 or 3 years. So the tech industry is used to that. But it's really, you have a Campbell's soup or you have a soup company. Yeah, they'll be making soup in 50 years, right? But they might be distributing it in a very different way. So all companies have to think of themselves as in the innovation business, and to do that, you need to build a foundation of agility, and that's what they're realizing.
Great. And another question that came in, I think this one is interesting in looking at your matrix, but how do you quantitatively measure business agility? If you're doing everything you can to communicate and set up a structure for success, which is a lag measure, what are some of the lead measures that you can look at to make sure that you're headed in the right direction?
So what we recommend is that for each industry, and we have it for 22 industries, there are certain agility dimensions that drive economic performance. And I showed you a little bit of that data, more in aggregate. I just basically showed that high economic performers also had high agility scores. But imagine you were in the transportation business and you looked at the agility scores for 5 other companies that are your competitors in the transportation business. And you noticed that the 2 leaders in the industry had really high agility scores in supply chain, and you didn't. And that would tell you that agility dimension is one that you should really focus on. So that's the way to do it. It's to not try to tackle all 10 areas, but to understand for your industry what is the most important agility dimension. Maybe it's insurance and it's about channel integration, because you're worried about the direct insurers coming in and blowing away your agency model. So if you don't get to an omni-channel experience and compete with the Progressives and the Geicos of the world, you're going to be out of business. So for insurers in property and casual, it's probably channel integration that you want to be focused on. So it's a way to not try to boil the ocean, but to pick the dimension that's most important for you and for your industry.
Oh, great. Thank you. So let me take a second, and if I could get a little bit of help with the slide here in making the transition, I wanted to do an introduction of myself. I am the industry manager for finance and accounting for Perceptive Software, and I've been working prior to this role in some global roles around procure-to-pay operations management, and was responsible for North America sourcing for Lexmark. And I've done a lot around rolling out shared service centers, looking at global implementations of whether it was a purchasing system or a travel agency, corporate social responsibility, and other operational excellence, but have been really focused on looking at and working with the shared service centers and how do we develop those teams and move on. And now I've come on to a role with our software division working for Perceptive Software. And with Perceptive, we're really working to be a pioneer of solutions that unleash finance teams to do and be the best we can be by taking all of the hard things, the manual work, the manual efforts, and automating them, and so that you can really focus on the higher value activities and not constantly firefighting with all the manual processes. So to talk today about what we're going to go through, and if I could get a little help with the slide, I want to go through the agenda of just let's understand the shared service center evolution. Let's talk about then with that shared service center evolution, some of those, how we got to where we are and how we can sort of make sure we recognize where we are in order to make a significant improvement. We'll talk about some common challenges to process health and growth. I'll go through how a process looks, what makes it up in that life cycle, and how we can work to build some successful processes, from designing that process to working through the management and culture, some incentives and empowerment, and leveraging then technology as our enabler. So if we could move ahead here, where we started in this effort was we were planning out a process to move to the shared service center. And these indicators here are, there were some things that were working against us and there were some things that were working for us. I mean, in the beginning, we go through an exercise of, let's make sure we understand the process. And in doing so, we tend to uncover these process gaps that have been in place, but we may have been so used to them that we were working around. But as we go through this evolution in the shared service center, we work through that step. And then we go through some standardization of what those processes are, and we start to see some small optimization of what's happening. These processes still in the planning stage are resource intensive, and it is disruptive to the organization. So we start seeing things kind of pushing us backwards. As we go into the next phase of conversion, we start to see then that there is this big cost of transition. We're going through training exercises, making sure that staff that doesn't necessarily want the work to go away to a shared service center actually then is training people that want to do the job but don't have the background and the business knowledge of the why decisions were made, why processes are working in the way that they are. Then there's a lot of implementation costs and different inefficiencies in that learning curve. So where there might be that happy path where they know what to do in all cases as the process works perfectly, any sort of exception handling just isn't going very well, or it takes a lot more effort and time to work through that process. Then we get into sort of that phase one as we start to turn the ship around, the oil tanker, as Craig talked about, where the process then becomes a little bit more standard. We start to do some process proofing where the process, as we start to make minor tweaks and adjustments and working in the new shared service or global model is helping us. And we start to see then a reduction in total resource costs for the effort. Folks are getting still a little bit up to speed in how things are. They understand the words on the page if you had a standard document, or they start to understand what it really means to implement these things. But we're still in this first phase, just seeing a lot of escalations and exception management. Then we start to get into period 2 where things get a little bit better for us, where we start to see that the process does stabilize even farther, and we start to see a little bit more acceptance then of the team as they are working with the corporate office and getting things to sort of work. And then as we move out of that, as we get farther into the cycle, and this might be 6 months, this might be 3 years into the process, now we start to see a degradation of what's really happening. So there's this separation of the process then in how it's working and how it's aligned to the business. And we start to see now, as we get farther in, staff starts to turn over. So the knowledge we invested in is turning over. And we know in shared service centers that turns over at a higher frequency than in traditional models. And then sort of, I think the one that we all don't talk about or think about is the process has been in place long enough that it becomes a little bit of a corporate afterthought, where the investment in time and the focus in time of the resources in the central offices or the regional offices and working with that shared service center isn't something that they focus on at all. And so we'll talk about this in a minute, but we start to really see a separation then from what the process needs to be and what it is performing at as sort of the status quo. Okay, next slide, please. So where we see these challenges then in keeping the processes aligned is having this need for agility when we look at the process. So how do I take this process and really make sure that we stay aligned with what the oil tanker needs to do in that example? I think is great. So if there is a different place we need to go, let's not stop, or let's not keep going in the same direction just because that's what we've planned to do. And so how do we keep those aligned? We have to then focus as well on the knowledge worker and make sure that as much as possible, the decisions that need to be made are as close to the source of the information and the source of the decision that needs to be made as possible, so that if there isn't a delay or there isn't the exception management, there's much more ownership at the knowledge worker level. Management needs to recognize what exceptions are and understand how to set up the right culture for that. So is there a certain acceptable level of risk and empowerment that can be given to the knowledge worker to succeed, but more importantly, to fail in these steps so that they can make the right decisions and they feel comfortable making the right decisions. And it's very clear that there's a box that if they're going to go out of that box, then that they know that they need to engage the right oversight or the right additional approvals to make those happen. And then, as Craig talked about, we absolutely have to leverage the technologies to make sure that this is clear. So if the process isn't visible, we might not know when things are not operating as efficiently as possible. If the process isn't flexible so that we can adjust it as we need to on the fly and put that technology flexibility in the hands of the people that are working the process and not necessarily make it a technology development exercise, that becomes incredibly important to ease in how we're working. So if we jump then to the next slide, let's talk a little bit about a process. And when I think about a process, I think about it in the simplest sense. So a process is a step one going to a step two. And when you think about those aspects between step one and step two, there is a gap. And that gap needs to be understood as well as what step one is and as well as what step two is. Because if you look at who is doing step one and you look at who is doing step two, you'll start to see that those teams, those organizations, those different locations around the world, those places then have different priorities. They have different measurements, they have different recognitions, different rewards. And what team one is doing at the speed that team one wants to do it, team A, is a different speed than necessarily what team B needs to do and work through it. So making sure that we understand what those are, as well as recognizing what the gap is. So if I've got something in a process and I need to hand it off to a different team, do they have all of the information that they're expecting? Do they have all the information and knowledge that they need in order to make that change? And we have to make sure that these solutions span that, so that it's very visible, it's very obvious on where things need to happen, so that these processes can happen as seamlessly as possible. And then to go to the next slide, what we see then in these processes as they evolve over time is that if we're not focused on them, we started with the defined process that was absolutely aligned to the business need. And then over time, we shift and we adjust and we fix those processes. The business needs might change, and we don't necessarily then stay aligned where we want to go. And I've seen this in lots of different processes, whether they're financial, accounting, purchasing, and whatnot, where the team has done what they've always done, but they haven't necessarily stayed in touch with the stakeholders. And as the stakeholders needed something, or something became less important to them, more important to them, having that connection to the process and being able to adjust, because it was so difficult for them to adjust, they just sort of kept processing as they were, and we start to see this rather significant separation. So let's talk a little bit about how we can build a successful process. And I think in how we want to consider those things is making sure that the processes are visible, that the data is visible, and we've got everything in place for them, that it can happen through technology versus needing to engage physically, whether it's phone or email or in person with the people involved. So as much as you can leverage the technology to make sure that the people know in the process what's happening now, what's going to happen next, who's responsible next, and how do I make sure that the action is taken, is incredibly important. We also have to think about geography and how people naturally interact. A lot of things, when they're done in a small group in a centrally located setting, things happen as much on the water cooler or on the elevator, on the stairs, as they do sitting desk to desk. And I've seen in shared service centers where people never interact, even though they're just a floor away, and they want someone from the corporate office on the other side of the planet to engage to kind of help things along. So again, let's make sure that the teams know each other. They know what drives the first team to succeed, what drives the second team to succeed, and they can work to help each other. And they have these shared activities and shared metrics to be able to move forward successfully. And then we also want to look at the time difference and where can we start to leverage processes to make sure that they operate in as efficient a manner as possible. So if we know things are going to happen in one geography and another step later on happens in that same geography, can we figure out a way that we can have sort of a follow the sun model of making sure that the process completes on time and that folks understand everything that they need to do, and they do it either in the beginning of their day or they're pushed to do things or triggered to do things throughout the day, so that we don't lose the gaps in time. And then as we look at the steps of the processes as they go through, let's make sure that we've got very clear ownership to each of the tasks, and there is as much as the step is covered, that who owns it until it's handed off, and so that if there's a problem handing something off from team A to team B, that it's very clear how we're going to go fix that, how we're going to go adjust it, and where the metrics are to raise that visibility so that we can see if things do become bottlenecks, that we're able to address them. And then when we talk about technology and helping us do all of those things, we have to think about the technology as something that enables us for the process, not something that we're defining how the process is executed. And in implementing ERPs and implementing various systems, I've heard so many times where people have said, well, that's how the system works. And if that is what's driving our business process, there definitely is something wrong. So we want to make sure that we've got the technology in place that allows us to adjust and to do things much more efficiently than some of the core ERP may drive us to do, or the core system may force us to do. But we have to use a workflow tool that's very flexible. And then we want to make sure that we've got the ability to manage that process has to be in the hands of the process owners. I've had situations where, for example, I was setting up a supplier data management system, and to adjust a workflow, I was going to move a system from being parallel or from being sequential to being parallel. And in doing so, it was about 60 effort hours. I had to get it prioritized, et cetera, where if I'd been using the right technology, I could have just dragged and dropped a solution there where I'd move a box and have that just adjusted, and I'm able to do it on the fly, and it's not something that requires significant IT investment at all. And then what we want to think about is, again, the technology is giving us that information at the time we need to make the decision. If I'm making a decision as to whether or not I want to approve a purchase requisition, what I need to know is this on budget? Did we plan this or not? Is this with a supplier that I wanted to work with, et cetera, et cetera? And I want to be able to click on whatever I need to and pull that information up so I can make the decision on the fly, whether I'm using my mobile device, whether I'm on my desktop, wherever I am. I need to be able to do that. And lastly, we need to see that as the process starts to cross these boundaries of mobile, of desktop, of communication in across one system to another system, one ERP to another ERP, however things are happening, that has to be transparent to the user, because one of the biggest hurdles for us is just that change management, as Craig talked about, where we can't afford to train users, and we can't afford to train organizations and thousands of our internal consumers on what the technology needs to be. It needs to be very seamless for them, so they learn it once and they can interact with it in any way that they want. Okay. So with that, I'd like to move us to question and answer. And again, if you haven't had a chance, look in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. Click on the enable group chat function, and that will allow you to start to ask us some questions. So Craig, I think we can talk a little bit about this one together, but the first question I have from the audience is, how does all of this relate to the Six Sigma technology or the Six Sigma methodology? You know, Six Sigma does a really good job of starting to look at metrics and start to put together how do you get to sort of a control setting of where you expect things to happen in a certain way. I have found in these, one of the things you do when you design a process is to look at what are sort of the upper and lower control limits for how we want to operate. So in defining that can be relatively difficult, but to look at where is it operating today, what's the point, what's your goal for that metric, in sort of making sure that you've got the right ROI. I've talked about it in the past, but you know, in the supplier setup scenario, it takes us about 3 days to set up a supplier. We looked at what it would take to do that in like half a day, and the investment and resources just didn't make sense. But so we start to say, okay, what's our expected metric, and then how do we look at things as they start to go within a deviation of that to get it there. But Craig, do you want to take that question as well?
Well, can people hear me? Is my audio back on?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, no, I would agree with that, and just point out that Six Sigma really started in the manufacturing world around data quality, and you know, it didn't really evolve to the other aspects of agility that are really important now for that we went through. Its focus comes from the discipline is wonderful, but it really comes from let me measure the number of defects in a manufacturing process and try to improve on that, and that's all great. But it's only one aspect that you need to really understand agility, particularly in the services environment in today's world.
Oh, great. Another one I've got is, as shared service center processes mature, what can you do to make sure that the team stays invested and aligned with business processes and overall corporate objectives? I'll take that one first, but for me, I think that what we have to do is take a look at our processes and just set up a cadence for review. So as you look at metrics, there is a scorecard, and definitely anything that's trending yellow or red, if you think about a yellow or green, yellow, red sort of concept, that you want to focus on. But just even to sort of say, okay, on a quarterly, 6-month, annual basis, depending on the process, let's just really dig down and leveraging, again, some of the Six Sigma ideas and saying, how do I talk to the workers and the people in the process? What are their biggest challenges? What is it that they're having difficulty in doing? And making sure we give them the opportunity to really sort of have this reboot of a process. Craig, I think you talked about it a little bit earlier, but making sure that we eliminated the layers of management so that the communication could get to the right level to make the appropriate change is really important as well. But do you want to comment on that one?
No, I think that's. I think you answered it very well. So.
Okay, and then I've got another question here on sort of the best practices or tools that Perceptive uses for the knowledge worker to stay engaged or focus on the business with shared service centers to help them feel a little bit more connected to internal and external customers. And I think, when we talk about the software that we're using, and we use our own software, is to try to make sure that as you look at the process, it's very clear going from step to step where something is in the process, also going from step to step where we can see things in the process from a like who it's pending, how long it's been in the queue, how we can work with that, that document, what needs to happen next. Also, in our tools, like I use the PO example, if I'm on a purchase order and I have a question, it's very easy for me to get to the associated invoices, the associated purchase requisition, and it's very easy for me to see all of that information regardless of how I've initially linked to the tool. So I think that I don't have any other questions. So with that, I'd like to wrap up, and Craig, definitely thank you for spending the time with us today. This has been very, very interesting. And I want to make sure that everyone knows that this replay of this video cast will be available shortly on our eDigest following this event. You can also access our previous webcast on AP automation, as well as look at the topics and speakers for February and for March. So Craig, thank you very much again. And
my pleasure, Matt. Thank you.
I look forward to us working together again soon.